Thanks everyone for joining. Joel, Roger, John, Jim, Nolan. Today we're going to talk a little bit about from textbooks to tablets, integrating technology into the classroom, something we all know has got to happen and is happening. And the three areas we want to cover are how it's changing the way kids learn, which is pretty fascinating. Then some of the challenges of getting it into the school system. We've talked a lot over the last few days about the challenges of breaking into the school system and making change anywhere, particularly with technology. And then finally, we're going to talk about what we get if we win, which is going to be some of the big meta changes that we can see at the end. So why don't I start it with Nolan? Why don't you tell us a little bit about, and I'll ask everyone in this first bit to give us a minute or two about their background. But you've spent a lot of time keeping kids entertained. Tell us how you're using that in education.
I probably started my career at Atari. I founded Atari, and then I made a big rat famous called Chuck E. Cheese. You know, both has made me cursed by parents. And so what I felt that I needed to do was to redeem myself. And so even though video games are addictive, I decided to create some software for education that was equivalently addictive. And so BrainRush is, you know, in about a couple of hundred schools right now. We have teachers all over the world making content for us for free and fun, and it'll be free. So pick it up, go into BrainRush, and we'll have some great fun. And
how are you seeing kids learn differently with the technology? How are you seeing it's changing the way they learn?
It is so fast. Kids learn faster with our software by about a factor of 10. And so what we find is that kids, when they're learning quickly, they think it's fun. And that's really, really important.
Excellent. Why don't we turn to Roger? You've got, and also we have on the panel, we have from single school to lots of schools, to looking at the whole country, to having lots of schools and looking at the whole country again too, all from different ways. So to Roger for one.
I was born in a small town in Nebraska, and really born into poverty. There were rats in the walls, and we had no drinking water that was fit to drink, and so I was poverty. And so that was a teacher for me, saying, how do I get out of this? And to me, the answer was education. And so that's really what motivated me. When I went to school, I wanted to learn, how do I get out of this? And how can this help me? I spent 20 years teaching public school in Nebraska, and then the last 14 years I've spent at Milken Community High School, which is a private Jewish school here in Los Angeles. And in a way, public school, one of the reasons I came here was just opportunity. There was a lot of sort of a stack 'em deep and teach 'em cheap mentality in public schools, and the bureaucracy. And Milken has allowed me the flexibility to you know, really focus on I think education and not on bureaucracy. So.
And how are you seeing the kids learning differently from when you grew up?
Wow. I think one of the things that I would say when I grew up, I was sort of limited to a subset of what the teacher knew and what the textbook had. And in my day, I know my parents sacrificed greatly to buy like World Book Encyclopedia. So there was like everything in the world's knowledge was in the encyclopedia. But now that's so different. I have kids that we actually do video conferences via Skype in a classroom to world experts. They're connected to people that are doing things right now, research labs. And so through technology, it's no longer like you need the one-year update for your World Book. You can get leading researchers, leading scientists, and give them access to kids that are 14, 15, 16 years old. And those kids are forming corporations, and they have patents, and they have, they're published in scientific journals in high school. And that wasn't happening when I grew up.
Got it. Joel, you've had the school system, and now you're bringing your adaptive learning to the school system. Tell us how you've seen it change in a across being on both sides in the last 5 years?
So a little like Judy Collins, I've looked at life from both sides now. So having run the largest school district in the country, and John's running the second largest, and I just want to say at the outset what an incredible job he's doing and how lucky you are in Los Angeles to have him here. And for me, when I left the chancellorship in New York, one of the ideas that was so clear to me is that we were not using technology to improve teaching and learning in the ways that we could. And one of the things News Corp decided to do was to make a big effort in this field. We're all aware of the challenges, and we'll talk about them, but let's start by looking at the potential. And at least in our company, there are 3 things that we think are going to be critical to this. The first, and I think in terms of the way kids learn differently, Rafi, is the customization, the personalization. If you've been in classrooms, when you see one teacher trying to navigate 25, 30 kids, some of whom are accelerated, some of whom need remediation, it's much, much easier to do that when she has information, data, and so forth. We have a whole division that's working now with 3 million kids and 200,000 teachers throughout the country that actually customizes the experience. So if a kid's struggling with reading, we can identify where the problem is, whether it's in phonemic awareness, whether it's in comprehension, or what have you, and then drive to the kid on an individualized basis much, much more information. Second thing that technology can do is make the experience much more engaging. The kind of thing Nolan's talking about is mission critical. I've seen this work now with kids because we've got them, for example, kids who are struggling with a book. If we give them the first chapter being read by somebody they know, and gives them an emotional engagement with the book. It's a very different learning experience. And then the third thing, which is also critical, is the way teachers teach. It's not just the way kids learn, but the way teachers teach. And technology can be so empowering to them. And from the scope and sequence of what you're doing in a classroom to tools that will help you. On our tablet, we have a thing called a quick poll or a quiz. And they're getting right then and there in the classroom that you can see whether the kid is getting the lesson or not getting the lesson, and what modifications you need to make, and which kids didn't really engage, and how you get them engaged the next time. So there's so much that can change. But I want to emphasize this point and come back to it time and time again. It's not about gadgets and gizmos. It's not about putting a tablet in a kid's hand. If you don't view this through the lens of teaching and learning, you will not succeed. When I was chancellor, the number of computers that sat in boxes was amazing to me. And the reason they sat in boxes is teachers were not convinced it would enhance the learning or the teaching experience. And unless it does that, it won't work.
Joe, a follow-up to that is, how many schools you're in and how many students are using it?
Well, right now at different levels, so we've got 3 divisions, but at our main division, the one that's been in business for a decade, they're in probably thousands and thousands of schools, and with 3 million plus kids. Our tablets will be 20,000 this fall in Guilford, North Carolina. Other schools now using them, several hundred different tablets in various school districts throughout the United States. In our curriculum, which is the piece we've been working on for 3 years, we have demoed and piloted this with thousands of kids and teachers and be rolling out in schools in the fall. I want to roll it out in a controlled, small way. It's 150 days of integrated curriculum and games, and it's a user experience like nobody's ever seen.
The question I think is going to be super interesting is to know within each classroom what the average distribution is of how many different learning paces there are on average per class.
I think the answer to that is simple. It's give me the number of kids and I'll tell you the number of learning paces. It's just each kid learns both differently in different ways and different paces. That doesn't mean they don't have to experience a common learning experience. They got to read Shakespeare, but the way they do, the way you get them engaged, the pacing of the kid. We're going to move, I think, away from a sort of annualization. I'll be curious what John thinks about this, toward a much more competency-based way to think about education. Cory Booker always used to say, right now, we hold time constant and performance varies. Why don't we get time to vary and make performance constant? That would be a kid-focused way of educating people.
John, I think you're next. Tell us about how you see it changing currently in the field.
So I have the privilege of being the superintendent of schools here in Los Angeles. We have pre-K, K through 12, young adult ed, 909,000 students, about 1,019 individual schools. We're in the middle of a historic technology teaching initiative with a one-to-one initiative for all youth in the system. And it is filled with opportunity and filled with challenge. And we have a lot of early learning around this. So your question is, how is this changing what we're seeing happening in learning? So I'm going to say it's changing it in kind of 3 ways. One way is about content. And so heretofore, content was constant. You had a static textbook, you had a static worksheet, you had a piece of text, you had knowledge that didn't change whatsoever the entire year, and you worked through that. Content is now constant. Students have almost constant new and different opportunities to access content. And that is done either in live time or it's done day over day. And so the reality is, I have 300 million textbooks in our inventory. I would venture to say there's not a single textbook that talks about the Arab Spring. It just doesn't, because they weren't published at that point. That is not a worry for students any longer in this relationship through technology. So that's
History teacher.
Yeah, that's been a big, big change. Second major change is kind of a little bit along the lines of what Joel said. Students don't necessarily learn through a single relationship with one adult and one piece of content. So students are learning in the evenings. The number of students who just access individual and collective tutorial sites. Students are learning collectively, has a huge issue around that. Multiple adults are helping students through the access of technology, and that has really changed. And I'll talk a little bit later about, I think one of the fundamental changes we're watching taking place in high schools is where are students getting courses from? I think that portends a major shift in public education. And then the third change is the relationship with the adult in the school and the teacher. So students come truly today with, the reality is, more advanced skill in how to manipulate the device and the technology than the adult. And the adult comes into the classroom with vastly more knowledge about content. And so the relationship is, hey, I can actually get you online, I can help you work the device, and in turn you will then of course help me learn. And has formed a very different relationship, and I think a much healthier one. And you're watching teachers create kind of the notion of flash mobs, flash tutorials. So in a day, they have realized where the majority of youth have struggled on a topic in an English department, boom, that's the tutorial at the end of the day.
Really?
Those are 3, I think, fundamental things that we're watching.
Can you, a little bit more on that? A flash tutorial, meaning that teacher says, I see the whole class, and what I found is that today it seems like 1/3 of the class had a problem with subject X.
And that's across all the math teachers in the school.
And so then
that becomes the subject of the tutorial at the end of the day, as opposed to, you didn't pass the test on Friday, so therefore we're going to redo all the content again. But no, I just actually didn't get polynomials. And most of the class didn't get that today. Highly customized, as Joel was saying, in real time to help students.
You readjusted the curriculum on the day.
Correct.
Or the pace of it.
Right.
That's cool. Jim, maybe tell us a little bit about some of your work on a national basis, and also that you're the only guy whose day job is not education. So a little bit about that as well, and then some of the things you've been telling us about how kids are learning a little bit differently, or how teachers can think about teaching differently.
And so I'm sitting here with some of my personal heroes on the front lines of education, and I'm coming at it from a different direction. A little over 2 years ago, I came into my office to find back-to-back calls from Arnie Duncan and Julius Janikowski. And that was interesting, a little bit odd. So what they asked me to do was to put together a commission, think of it as Simpson Bowles on educational technology, to look at 3 questions. What was happening in the country? Probably the most vexing question, which is why was it happening so slowly? And third, what could we do at a national level to try to accelerate that? I, of course, said no to that at first because I have a day job, but I thought about it, and what we do in investing is look at markets as they develop, so we took some of those tools into the educational technology market. And as we went through that, it was clear that fabulous things were happening, as we were talking about on the front line, but that the market was also desperately broken and that we had a huge national challenge in front of us. We'll get to some of that later, but to answer your particular question about the promise that we saw, and I won't go to the individual things, but instead the promise in the market. Just for fun for a second, let's take the analogy of the record business. So 15 years ago, if there was a room like this of record executives and people familiar with it, they probably couldn't have seen just how fundamentally different the industry would be 15 years later.
Right.
The units would change. No longer do we buy albums. The delivery mechanisms would change. The cost structures would change. The entire structure would change in a way that you can now do a mixtape in minutes. You can listen to the music you want when you want it. So we started to get into some of those same questions. I think it's fascinating. So why are classes 50 minutes long? Well, that's how you schedule classes if you have buildings and you want to have so many classes per day. Turns out, John, right, the right learning time is more like 15, 20 minutes.
Right.
You know, why the question of 7th grade math, what an absurd concept. The idea that all 7th graders would be doing the same math at the same time, but yet that's how our education system works. And just as we might have asked why albums are so expensive, why are textbooks so expensive in a world where content everywhere is you know, really telescoping down prices? So I think we stand at the very early days of what can be a fundamental and quite positive shift in our education system broadly. We're seeing it on an international basis where other countries are arguably ahead of us. But I think by taking some of the threads that the people on this panel are starting and pushing them forward, we have an opportunity, I think the best opportunity, to fundamentally change and better our education system.
Thanks. I'd also like to thank you for calling out the idea of mixed tapes. Somebody else remembers. That's going to stay with me. So now let's switch to the second topic. How are we going to make it all happen? In addition to a lot of the spot things that are going very well, some of the bold choices a couple of folks here are making. I want to pull up a slide. We did a little bit of research. Let's see if the slides come up. On, I guess the slides are up there? Nope, not that one. Forward to number 8, please. Number 7, sorry. So did a little bit of research in the process of trying to help a school in New York City procure some e-readers and tablets, and decided to research the 70 pilot programs that we found going on, and only a handful of them actually reported control groups. 18% of them used a formal control group, and 2/3 of them actually had some measured results. As you can imagine, those that measured had much better success. And let's skip to the next slide. This was also pretty interesting. A pretty diverse set of funding. We've got well north of 14,000 school districts in the United States. And if this is what the schools say is where their funding comes from, the question is going to be, Joel, how does a guy like you go to somebody and say, where's the money going to come from? And same with Nolan. And so I think we're good with the slides. Now, with that, the procurement is complicated. And not to mention the teachers don't even know which content they may want, particularly if it's changing that fast. And we used to have 3 textbook providers. It was pretty easy to say who's going to give me the whole block of curricula. So now we've got people don't know how to buy the technology, they don't know the content, and they don't know where the money is going to come from. Who wants to go first?
Let Daisy go first, because he did it.
Right.
I mean, he's got the widest, largest implementation in the country going on right now in Los Angeles. Yeah.
So let me comment on a couple of things. One is that just like students, we're learning every day about this. And to think that it's going to be perfect is foolish. Just like students struggle, the learning from this is very, very important. Second of all is, let me talk about funding sources first and then work into procurement. So this slide makes sense to me, why it would be so defined and so possibly diffuse. See, we are fundamentally a governmental agency. We're government. Governments regulate. They don't innovate. And so we come from the history of how to understand to do things in a highly regulatory way. This slide is going to change when the variety of the entities, and I'm looking at the slide, the pie chart slide, when those variety of entities find a way to think about new ways to source, finance, and capital to support lifting youth out of poverty. And this is a very important issue around that. So that's going to be an enormous piece. We're not there yet. So for us, we fundamentally wanted access for every single student, overwhelming. Almost 90% of our youth live in circumstances of poverty. What we wanted was every youth to have a device and to have content and the professional development for that. We chose to bid it in a procurement process in stages as a package. Content, PD, security, device, support, connectivity, etc. And what we learned was pilot program, lots of good learning from that, first wave, second wave around this piece, and even the knowledge from the first two procurements have changed how we're going to do the third and fourth procurement around this piece. One of the things that we learned around this was the ratio of support needed for the adults to use the device and access the content was much, much higher than any PD we had ever seen before. You bring in textbook, you bring in new curriculum, you need to provide some professional development. This is so much larger in terms of being able to do that. And the front-end funding for that was nowhere near necessary. That's shifting as we do that piece.
Is it taken from the textbooks? You told me you have $300 million in textbooks?
I mean,
what's happening to the textbook spend? Is that just going away and changing to training for teachers?
Yeah, we're watching. Teachers will be able to customize content so much faster. And this is all taking shape inside of the implementation, the rollout of the Common Core state standards. That is no longer about the textbook being the curriculum and the driver. It's the standards being the driver, of course, and content having a great deal to be able to innovate in the classroom. So teachers needed fields of opportunity and choice to do that. And it's just a very different way of thinking about that. On the procurement side, people just have never done this before. We know how to build a building, we know how to buy a textbook, we know how to buy a calculator. Right. The notion of being able to deal with this procurement, we watched and learned from government entities that have bought very, very large pieces. And I think the best learning for us is do it in phases. Your procurement at the end of this will look different than your procurement at the beginning of this.
So right now is it that, first of all, budget-wise, you said, okay, we're going to take from textbooks, we're going to take from other training, we're going to reallocate that budget to here. Some of it is we're going to let the teachers or the principals in the school say, given there's Common Core, you now have a bigger variety of choice from which to choose based on the content that we have. How have you putting those systems in?
Initially, the device, the hardware and the device around this piece, this is capital.
Yeah.
It's maintenance is our responsibility. It's content down the road and customization is our responsibility. So we have bonds in Los Angeles for which we heretofore were building computer labs.
Yeah.
That is already becoming obsolete. So the idea is portable and it's one-to-one, and so therefore you move to the tablet piece around that. The PD, big issue about how we're going to continue to maintain that. We need other, I would argue, the other sources of funding, which are in your pie chart, to be able to be flexible, which means governments have to have a different notion of flexibility for an outcome as opposed to control for a standard.
Got it.
But to give you an example of that, when I used to testify every year, they had a line item under our New York state law that was for textbooks. And they'd give you, in your budget, the state would give you, let's just say, $600 million that you had to spend on textbooks. And every year I'd go up and testify and I'd say, do me a favor, give me $500 million instead of $600 million, save you $100 million bucks, but don't earmark it for me. Let me use it as I think best. Everybody's smiling, and every year I got rejected. Now you would think I saved them $100 million bucks and all I wanted to do is have the discretion to do this. And that kind of process, when Jim says this market is broken, he understands deeply what a highly regulated, irrational market it is. So the kind of pie chart that you put up, Rafi, hardly surprises me, but that's because we're in the early innings.
Right.
And what's going to happen is if people think there's a compelling case, if schools come to the view with what John's doing and other districts are now doing, and they say that if you take a tablet and you can use that to distribute content and curriculum in a different way, they will gradually move just the way they did toward textbooks, almost to a line item for it. But the reason it's now dog-eared is because people are very skeptical about the value add of what we're doing. And until we prove our case up, but once we prove our case up, then I think the funding will flow.
How long do you think it'll take?
I think it's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, I think look, there's a lot of learning in LA. There'll be a lot of learning that's going on in Guilford. Miami's doing a big implementation pretty soon. So people are going to get out there and see what's there. I think when people see the curriculum we've developed and the games we've developed, they're going to say, I want a device in order to get that information into the classroom.
And whenever I get depressed on,
Go ahead.
whenever I get depressed on this question, I remember the AT&T McKinsey study done back in the early 80s that said there were only going to be 500,000 cell phones in the world that led AT&T to sell their spectrum. The reason was because who was going to pay for them? They were big and clunky, and what could you do other than a voice call? And they dropped a lot of calls. So we have to constantly challenge ourselves to look ahead. So what John is doing today would have been unthinkable 4 years ago. Let's remember the iPad was introduced in April of 2010. The old days, you would have had to tear up walls. It would be massively expensive. You would have had to have disk drives and shrink-wrap software. The cloud, iPads, Wi-Fi have brought this down to it is almost within textbook budgets if you do it correctly. That's a staggering statement. It would have been $1,500 a student a year just a few years ago. So these things are in part going to sort themselves out over time if we let the market develop and if the market gets large enough that people are able to invest in it. So I get depressed at moments, but I also get optimistic because this sort of change to content markets has happened over and over again. This one is particularly vexing, but it will happen.
I actually think that it's going to happen very clumpily, that there are going to be certain districts that just sprint forward. And we're seeing training and things going so quickly in certain areas where others you can't even get in the door. You can't even start the dialogue. And I think that what will happen is some really extraordinary results will be coming out within a year or two that will cause avalanches, but not everywhere. It will be very discontinuous.
Right, these three guys up here are the key to it because if you think about technology adoption, I have never adopted technology that I read about and went to conferences about. My 16-year-old son walks in and shows it to me.
Yeah.
And so when this is going to work is when a superintendent who wants to deploy it can go to John and say, John solved these problems. And they are tough, but he solved them, and then it will happen pretty quickly. So the concept of modern, if you want to know, you in the audience, what you can do to help, fund some model schools. Be that 16-year-old with a device in the hand that shows other people how to make it work.
That's exactly what we're doing.
You just hit it on the head. I remember the very first day we rolled this out in our first wave, and I came home and I was like actually feeling great. I mean, we were just transforming the lives of kids, and I came home, my older children, they're a little bit older, they had come into the house, and I'm like really feeling on top of the world, and it's like, my son goes, Dad, calm down. You are only bringing the schools to where the kids already are. We actually think that a lot of this is transformational. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning.
I think that's where your PD comes from in a lot of ways. I think it comes from the most creative people in the world are less than 18 years old. Mm-hmm. And I learned most of what I know about technology from kids that are less than 18 years old. I rarely go to our IT department for a problem. I go to a 16-year-old because they know and they're there and then they're in the class.
Yeah, but the kids are not the impediment. I mean, if we gave the kids the vote, would they get rid of these textbooks that they carry in 50 pounds in a backpack for a tablet? I mean, this is not a hard question. The real challenge is going to be, can we convince teachers in the end that this enhances the teaching learning process? If they're the people who will have to evangelize the product. And a lot of them, unlike your kids, are like us. They, are digitally not adroit, to try to put this in not too fine a point on it. So they grew up in a different era. And what I'm seeing now, which has got me excited, is teachers who told me they had never used technology now seeing the value of the things that we're doing, and therefore want the learning, want the professional development. Teachers who don't want professional development, as John can tell you, won't be professionally developed. If they don't think this is something that's important to them, they'll sit in the room and eat a bagel or cream cheese, but they're not going to do the learning. So what this whole process is about, and what I think really is the only lens to focus through, is are teachers going to come increasingly over time to say this is value added to what they're doing? If they do, then the process will move rapidly.
I'd like to also, I would like to advertise while we're here to put on Jim's point, the idea, and then I'll ask Nolan about how these are getting into schools. It takes a tough guy to say I'm going to buy them for the whole system, but a lot of people in the Milken community have the means and capacity to go say, I'm going to go help a school do something. And we did that at our firm and found the same thing, is that Bronx Lab School, a public school, it's one of Joel's small schools in the Bronx. We said, we want to bring you tablets and e-readers. And they said, we don't know how to shop for the right curriculum. We said, okay, we'll run a competitive process. We'll get a bunch of folks in there. It was for a high school. And we're testing it out, and the teacher said, gee, we don't want to know if the kids will take it home. We don't actually want the kids to take them home. We're worried about it. So we did all this research about it, and John, we're going to ask you about how safe it is for them to take them home soon. So the idea is that you can really get into a school, get this technology in and get them to promote it, because it does start to have a network effect. And I'll ask Nolan, tell us about how you're starting, the way you're starting to sell in has not been district by district, right?
No, in fact, we don't sell. Ours is free. And you say, an old drug dealer friend of mine said, first one has to be free. And so the idea really is to get mass adoption, yep. and then bring in AP, remedial, extra subjects that are premium. And premium content works, and it's called a freemium model, and it works in the video game business wonderfully. And so our penetration is very simple, and a lot of our content is curated by the teachers themselves and then shared. There's a website that does Share My Lesson, and yes. Or Teacher Pay Teacher, and all that really creates an ecosystem. And we will be setting up essentially an educational app store in which any teacher will be able to use our software, throw it over the paywall, and charge a nickel, a dime, 50 cents, or a buck for it.
You were telling me earlier that you've got thought leadership and you've got teachers signing up and how that bubbles up. Can you tell the folks a little bit more about that?
Sure. What we found is we did our alpha test in Spanish vocabulary. The teachers that used our software, their kids ended up with a 1,500-word vocabulary at the end of Spanish 1. For the first time, they were able to teach Spanish totally, or teach Spanish 1 totally in Spanish. No English spoken anywhere. And a typical Spanish 1 kid will learn 150 words. And what they loved about it is they could spend all their time on grammar and syntax, not worrying about vocabulary, because it was knocked out using our software. And so what we've been able to do is create systems. Well, why don't you put in slide 12? We've been able to create a system that absolutely can track and understands how fast you learn. And so now, we can say we can teach almost any concept, any fact, any data point in about 2 minutes. And a lot of people don't realize there's a big difference between learning something and mastering it. And spaced repetition, you cannot learn something, you cannot master something through in a single setting. You have to constantly repeat and redo it in order to master it so that you've got it for a couple of years. And we track all this and can actually, when we say somebody knows something, they've mastered it and they won't forget it.
Do you find the teachers are now bringing it to the school systems to say, bring this in, we'd like to buy it more at scale?
Absolutely, and what we're finding is that one teacher will find it and they'll sign up, and then within weeks, the whole department is signed up, and sometimes the whole district.
And then it comes, I think that's also classically been a challenge with all the school districts and for all the investors in the audience, just in case there are some, with alternative ways to finance things or get teachers buying them a little bit at a time. Will it start to bubble up? And with teachers starting to look at things, will they say, now can I bring this up to the district? And say, will the district start to buy it on a system-wide basis?
Yeah. And it makes it easy when it's free.
It's easy when it starts when it's free, that is for sure. Jim, do you want to tell us a little bit about wiring the schools as one of the hurdles, that the constraints, and how to overcome that, and from a top-down plan?
One of the most shocking and interesting things that we found is that in a world where we get upset when there isn't Wi-Fi in our coffee shop, the schools of America are abysmally wired. So think of this as a TAM, or total available market problem. For this market to open, people have to invest in it, people have to deploy, we have to get the network effect going. But if only 10 to 15% of your schools are even available as customers, it begins to explain part of the reason this is happening so slowly. So one of the first things that came up in our work is that we needed to wire the schools, and one of the key findings is it's surprisingly cheaper than we thought, because the expansion of fiber over the past few years, particularly into urban areas, means that the best data we can find is probably for about $10 billion you could get to over 95% wired in the country. And just seeing that action begin to happen, I think, will be important in opening up this market. The good news for us is that I'm not a big government guy. I'm not necessarily a federal government guy, but there are times that we have to come together, think the interstate highway system, to make infrastructure work. There exists in Washington a program most of you have never heard of called E-rate, which was put in place in 1995 by Senator Rockefeller to originally wire schools to narrowband and to cell phones, quite frankly. It's a $3 billion a year program. It's on your phone bills, and it has been probably not optimally used, to say the least, over the past few years. So we've started an effort with the FCC, you'll begin to read more about this, to redo E-rate, which should, within 3 or 4 years, allow us, if we get behind it, to wire the country. We could solve this problem for a penny a day on people's phone bills for 3 years. And
several of our school districts have SIM cards in their tablets and are totally using 3G as their data path back.
Yes. So the first thing is we got to solve that. I think it's actually near term quite solvable, and it's beginning to happen. You may have noticed last summer the president announced something called Connect Ed, which was his commitment to wire 99% of the schools within the next 5 years. That was based on some work we had done. Took it to the White House, and I think this is now beginning to happen. So the first step, which is actually to get the schools wired, problem that a lot of the private schools don't have, but the public schools are deeply challenged by, is at least the ball is beginning to roll.
And good news is it's coming from the top down with a process. There is a mechanism with which to have that charge on our phone bill, the same way that we have charges on our phone bills for
Doesn't require
disability.
congressional action. All it requires is 2 or 3 FCC commissioners, and they've got the votes. So this is something that is going to be brought forward probably in the next 6 to 9 months.
There's also a microcell opportunity in which you just put in a little server in the classroom itself, and it obviates the need to go totally online all the time. You can and
that's our interim solution. That's exactly it.
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit more about that.
It's a crutch. It's
right.
an inline, but it's going to be absolutely necessary. We've got to deal with with a company that has students all over North Africa, and if you think we got a problem here, it's really difficult there.
And so you said you're putting in small servers.
Hotspots and small servers is the interim. So one of the things that is moving almost faster than this is the assessment system. So in California, the assessments for the Common Core in our state are computer adaptive. So there's no more, kind of your state test at the end of the year, there's no more paper and pencil. So everything is taken online, and it's computer adaptive, which means that the very test you're taking and I'm taking, you're taking are different. Same content. To make it granular for a second, I'm in the 7th grade, I'm working through the standards for English. It is reading how I'm giving the answers, so therefore it's providing me with either 8th grade or 9th grade level material, or it drops down to 6th grade or 5th grade material, so it gets a sense of exactly what I'm mastering. So that's very individualized. So the need to be able to be prepared for youth to access state assessments has actually driven this piece forward around connectivity, because we had to be connected for that piece. You asked us at the beginning of this about, what are we learning already?
Yeah.
I want to go back for a second to Joel's piece, because nothing of this is going to matter unless we actually have had the ability to transform how youth learn and that relationship with adults in the classroom. One of the most amazing things that took place very early on that we're watching is, I would say, pre this wave of tech innovation, everything was my piece of property, which was my term paper, to you, the teacher. It was one-on-one, and it was a singular piece of property. In classrooms today, it's collective creation of property, and the document, it does not exist in hard form. And so teachers are saying, how do I actually make judgments on the quality of something that is partially yours, and partially yours, and partially yours, because you created this together, and there's the fear that non-hard copy will disappear. And so we're trying to deal with two things. One is collective creation of product, which is exactly how it works in the real world when you go for a job, and how you make judgment calls on that. And then second of all is the portfolio is digital. And the kind of, we've had 20 years of a file cabinet with a digital portfolio. And the file cabinet is virtually there, and the worry about it's going away. So we're trying to wrestle with those two things. It's been so, so amazing.
Got it. And has anything come across as the super way to teach a teacher how to deal with the different sources of content? Have you found anybody who's got a super educational program of how does a teacher deal with, I could use video, I could use PDFs, I could use papers, I could use field experience, pull this thing together?
The ability for that we're watching happen at lightning speed around shared product. So kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of a wiki spine where teachers are putting best practice, putting on content created, so that the district doesn't drop into you Thursday's lesson plan. You have the best work at polynomials. I might have the best work in terms of thinking about fractions. We put that up there. I get to take that content. It's well developed. It's best in class. The ability for teachers to share virtually has actually spread best content and practice very quickly.
How many teachers do you have using that? Because that's really interesting to see, like, the adoption. And I'm going to come back in a minute to some of the technology expense and how we trust kids with all, and teachers with all this. But yeah, how fast is it spreading?
So there's just a cool note on this question. One of the big issues is if you go on Amazon or iTunes, you can see how many of what's been downloaded, and you kind of figure out what's popular.
Yes.
And if you travel today, what do? You go to TripAdvisor, and you see what other people who have actually traveled have chosen, and they're all rated for you. So in a world where there are thousands of educational apps, how do you know as a teacher which one to try? Because you can't get it wrong. The most interesting question, or most interesting thing we're seeing right now is something called Graphite, which is done by Common Sense Media, which think of it as TripAdvisor for educational technology. You can go on and see whether other teachers have found this particular app useful, and there is educational professionals who have rated all of them on key elements.
It's red hot.
This is red hot because this question of what struck us is there's been 1,000 flowers planted. I mean, incredible products, but there's no shape to the garden. And tech gardens tend to shape when there's platforms and ways to get information for adoption. And that's just beginning. And watch this space, because it will. Teachers want to use this, they just don't know what to use.
And it's really noisy.
They're really noisy.
It's got to be noisy for what? You got like 3 million.
And you've got to make it simple. If a teacher's got to spend a lot of time figuring out which is the best lesson on polynomials, game over. It's not going to happen. And that's one of the things people have to understand. The consumer model is not going to be as readily adaptable to this enterprise as people would like it to be. There are different things that are driving it. And so things like Graphite and other kinds will help the process. But one thing we have to keep in mind, if this thing becomes cumbersome and difficult to implement, it won't happen.
As a
Kids,
classroom,
though, students themselves will investigate things and choose things to help them in what they're doing. And a lot of times, the kids themselves are the digital pioneers. And they'll come back to the teacher and say, this is really good for the class. And that helps a lot.
That's a kind of a point that I'd like to make as a classroom teacher, is that some of the things I've heard here is like we're looking for apps, we're looking for tools to teach a class a lesson. But I've also heard a lot at this conference about educating the one, looking at a student and saying what's good for them, and then actually partnerships and mentorships and mentor relationships. And that's essentially what I'm doing at Milken Community High School, is I don't use textbooks anymore. I haven't for years. I taught physics for a long time. I stopped using textbooks, really requiring a textbook, in the 90s. And I said, buy any physics textbook you like, because you can use any of them in this classroom. They all have the examples and the background material and the reading, but I gave them my own materials, digital materials to go through and use. But the thing is, what I do, I cheat on several things. And I've got some slides that I could show you of some really excellent student outcomes. But how do you do it? Well, one of the things is a lot of kids are too busy going to school to learn, and you don't have time. You've got, in public school where I used to teach, I had 50 minutes every day. In private school where I'm at now, I have 60 minutes every other day. I have about 40% less classroom time to actually teach with anymore. But I get some extraordinary results, and the reason how I cheat on that is that I have the kids work on their own time for like 7 hours every 2 weeks. I require them to pursue what they are interested in. And Tony Wagner has a book, I don't know if I can credit him with the 3 new R's, but Relevance. And so if you talk to a kid, if you want a motivated kid, ask them what they're interested in. Ask them what they would like to do. In their spare time, when they're not too busy doing school or whatever else, what do they want to do? And that's where I start with them. And then I try to lead that down a path that will lead to like the Intel Talent Search or some other national innovation competition. If they're into sports, okay, let's look at like concussions. That's a big thing in football. And I was working with 2 kids in Nebraska, and the kid was he was smart, but he wasn't doing very well in school. And says, what are you interested in? Football. And I'd like to be able to like write apps for Apple, but I don't know anybody in my small town who knows how to do that. And I says, oh, okay, why don't you consider, football? If you like that, concussions are a big problem. Could you develop like an iPhone app that would use sensors in your helmet to tell whether you had experienced a hit that was strong enough or whatever? And I connected him with an 8th grade girl at our school who's written a number of apps. And so now they start collaborating, and you've got motivation there. So relevance is a big thing, according to Tony Wagner, and I agree. And the word polynomial, this came up several times on here. And again, as a poor kid going to school, I could factor polynomials. And I asked the question all the way through high school, when will I ever use this? And I never got an answer. And there are reasons, but I think now we ought to be teaching kids how to do coding that actually can do high-degree polynomials quickly, rather than going through manually and finding these lower example things. So there's relevance, and then there's relationships. And that's the next thing that I try to do. Once you tell me you're interested in something, I want to try to connect you to online resources, YouTubes, TED Talks, find out what researchers in this area or anywhere are doing this. And if you could connect to them anywhere in the world, you can Skype conference with them, you can have direct connection to people that are in the world. So it's relationships. And the third thing is rigor. And the thing is, if you write rubrics as a classroom teacher, they'll go to your rubric, and when they get the thing they want, they quit. My kids don't know enough to quit, because they're still interested in it, and they keep going. And then they end up doing some amazing things. Show slide 1, if you would, quickly, just as a student example. I also cheat on time. I don't have time, so I require the kids to do 7 hours outside work, and then I meet with them like once every 2 weeks for a half an hour individually. And I don't know how much individual time you get with students in a class of 50 or 40 or whatever. It's not much. But if you do that, and then they spend times, I get them placed in university research labs over the summer, and they spend 6 to 8 weeks, 8 hours a day in that research lab, the university research lab. You let them do that for a summer, and they get pretty smart.
So Roger, that's a great segue. Let's talk about not just what happens if we win in K-12, but we talked about learning and how fast kids can adapt. So universities. University, a lot of K-12 is pretty much to get into the right university, which is then a signaling to an employer that you theoretically have the skills. As I joke, Wharton is a vocational college from which we certainly recruit at my firms too. But can you take this all the way to where someone could get out of one of your high schools and not have to go to college because there are a bunch of employers lined up who say, I know that, first of all, also the testing doesn't have to be just the SATs. Somebody took a test that's different from the SATs, and I know, oh, that means they can do the job. Because I don't usually look at SATs at our firm, because my SATs were lousy.
The hiding in plain sight is the fact that Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and a whole bunch of really powerful business people never really attended very much college. And, I mean, the primary architect of the Atari 2600 didn't graduate from high school, but they were self-taught, self-motivated, and extraordinary people. And
let's take the, sorry to push on it, but let's take the middle. I mean, the non-extraordinary, but the kid who's looking at, like, what do I get if I win? So I've never been at our high school in the Bronx. I've never been to high school. No one in my family's been to college, and I'm looking at, loans. I could be taking on $160,000 in loans or going to places where I don't know people. And the average student, what's the path where is there a path for the average student to say, hey, you know what? I can knock this out. Someone's looking for me too.
We've known a path, and I can tell you that is changing overnight. Is in living time, this thing is looking very, very different. I mean, I don't want to make kind of bold predictions, but I'm going to say that I firmly believe that we're seeing a canary in the coal mine around the fact that the American high school is going to be fundamentally, remarkably different, and I would say in less than a decade. Youth walk in, and we have thousands and thousands and thousands of youth, are walking in substantial numbers to their guidance counselor on the first day of school and saying, here's my chemistry class. And they say, no, chemistry is in 217 down the hall. He goes, no, this isn't Stanford. I took it. It's online. I have the chemistry class. I want the credit for it. And it's like, what are you talking about? We give chemistry. No, you don't. Stanford gave chemistry. Here this is. I actually going to take another class. I think we're going to move to watching the high school curate a diploma rather than being the sole owner of the diploma. And that is allowing access for students that has never happened, particularly youth in circumstances of poverty. There are going to be, in short order, students who are going to easily move through what we call post-secondary while in secondary. And that is a gigantic economic lift for students. And second of all, it is going to have students enter opportunity for employment, which is the sole arbiter about whether students are going to be able to continue and not have to pay off these loans. This is changing for students in ways that is fundamentally upending what we think about high school and what we mean by post-secondary.
I also thinking about the ecosystem of the entire United States. Think about businesses hiring people.
That's right.
We put one of those psychographic tests into place just so that we could hire people to do our, who may not have had to go, because if they learn on their own. Joel, you built a school with a company.
Yeah, no, we did this with IBM, and which, again, I think John is right. I think the future is going to look entirely different. Look at just what Georgia State is now doing. You can get the same master's degree that costs you $55,000. You can get it online, the same degree, for $7,800. And we're going to now see what the differences are, the time differences, and of course you can move through it at exactly your own pace. You don't have to show up at 3:40 in the afternoon. If you want to work and do it in the evening, all of that's possible. What we did, and we found this model, I think, is going to have real power, and the president actually has not only touted in his State of the Union, but came to visit the school. We met with IBM and basically put together a school. It's a 6-year school, 4-year high school, 2 years of community college, and at the end of which you get certificated if you pass a very rigorous, demanding exam by IBM. So the only reason this works is because IBM says you now have the skills that we need to make you a technician, and if you do, you get priority hiring at IBM. And as soon as we did that model, I knew it would take off. And it's a very funny joke because the guy who was president at IBM agreed to do it, Sam Palmisano. As soon as Rahm Emanuel heard that he was doing this in New York, he called Palmisano. He said, I thought you were my friend. Why are you doing this for Bloomberg? And he said, well, they asked me. He said, okay, I'll do one for you too. And Rahm, being Rahm, said, no, if you did one for Bloomberg, you got to do 5 for me. So this model is going to take off. And it's a very powerful model. But what people are saying is, and it'll be interesting to see this play out. There's a panel yesterday on this between Neil Ferguson and Sebastian Thrun about the whole use of the MOOC and everything. We really don't know all the answers. It's early, and we got to look at how these things work. And you know, a lot of people sign up for MOOCs, never complete them. So we've got to make sure that these models work themselves through stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. But if you want to place a bet that education, not just K-12, but post-secondary, is going to look very different a decade from now. Very, very different.
Yep. Go ahead. I sit on a couple of university boards, and as a number of people in the room may, and you realize this is a top topic at universities today, and there's really 3 things going on. The first thing is they are fundamentally changing the classroom experience. So all these things we just talked about, universities are all wired, the kids all have devices, so they're already moving into how do you really deploy a flipped classroom, and I've watched it, it's extraordinary. The second point is, can you change the university structure? And this probably isn't happening around the Ivies, it's happening at community colleges. So in places that are really challenged, can they bring better content in and have interactive classes? The third thing is the thing that's getting all the press and maybe having the least amount of impact today, which is MOOCs, and the question of, is a university even a physical place today? So all 3 of these things are going to go on, but as we all know, the university system is one of the jewels of this country, and a lot of what will end up in K-12 is being percolated right now in the universities.
So that's a big question. Does this start to help us think, if we think nationally that the university system is the jewel of the country, and right now technology is so available, it's clearly moving jobs outside of the country because people can work from anywhere. And so is it something which says, gee, do we have to let go of that as the university jewel as employers? Not necessarily just as the education side, because on the education side, we're saying that K-12 can start to put up as good results.
I hope not.
With technology.
I actually hope a different thing happens. I hope the entire lid comes off on the capping of the ability to get in and access. So if we take a look at just in California, the percentage of youth from other countries who are entering the University of California system versus the percentage of youth coming out of our own high schools is grossly disproportionate. This is a way to remove a barrier for access that I think will be vastly, vastly helpful for the economic infrastructure of this country and this particular state. So I'm hoping it is just the opposite. Not that the university will look different, but access to university will become much, much larger.
So you're saying so many of your kids who will learn faster, will just come out of the gate so much faster to get into colleges, they're going to say, I never knew all these kids were doing all this, I got to take them all in.
Just take a look at the rejections. You got accepted. We have X number of seats that we can give you.
Yeah.
Why can't every student who qualified go? Because there is a physical structure to the university at the moment. The university should, in my opinion, the academy should not go away, far from it. It should be available to vastly more.
Maybe we need to have a third type of institution, which is kind of a supper club with labs. And you know, I think that with that, because the social interaction, I mean, the amount that I learned from my fraternity brothers and my peer group can't be underestimated. And I'm not sure that that being on Skype is the same as sitting on the floor of the dorm room drinking Pisano.
This point about international students, though, and Joel, you could probably comment on this. If you want to get really frightened about this, go travel internationally and see what's happening there. So I went to Singapore and South Korea and met with the education ministers. South Korea is doing away with paper textbooks by 2016. They're 100% wired, claim to be 100% teacher trained. And when I asked the education minister, well, have you tested? He said, how can it not be better? We're creating a workforce that is going to be, you know, do you test textbooks before you put them out? Well, they're just doing it, and that risk to us is substantial.
Korea went from almost nothing in the video game business to being one of the world powerhouses just because their whole country is wired.
One thing that obviously you've got an entrenched purchasing base, labor force. How do we de-risk? How do we de-risk bringing technology into the classroom and the tablets? Maybe a little bit about, we found very little breakage. How did you find it when you give kids this?
So a couple of points. One is one that I don't have an answer for, but we have to do. We have got to celebrate courage of policy leaders who are pushing this forward. So it is not in the DNA of school boards to want to take these kinds of risks, and when they do, that actually needs to be elevated and celebrated. There's a fascinating thing that's taking place about the relationship to a youth with a device and a youth to a textbook. I mean, I can give you the stats, but LA is enormous. But the amount of money that I have to spend annually to take care of vandalism, loss, theft is large. It's very large. It's in the millions. We have had less than 17 devices lost.
Out of how many?
Thousands. Thousands, tens of thousands, 47,000 so far.
47,000 devices, you lost 17.
And well, of course we can recover them because we've chosen to do this.
Right.
But the fact is, the youth gets to customize it. It is a very different relationship. There is no desire to lose this or vandalize this in any way whatsoever. We put a tremendous amount into making the community and the parent and guardian and the youth secure, and that I won't get robbed, and I know that there's a responsibility to this piece. So we don't discuss it, but the technique of it, but there's a huge relationship between the county sheriffs, the LAPD, and the LAUSD police department. We did a whole series before we did this of commercials and public service announcements so that parents and guardians would realize that if it is stolen, it is useless. It is turned into a brick instantaneous. Right. There's an entire system that does this. You come in, it got stolen from me, it's impossible. And we come and find you. And we come and find you because we know where the device is, we know all the content, we all know the pieces of the device, and we actually can retrieve it. Second of all is, we learned this lesson in many ways from Joel about the safety of the device, and so it doesn't break, and we have kindergartners and high school students being able to use this.
What's the secret to it not breaking? I know Joel's building one's got size around it. We saw in our research that fess up and buy the more expensive case. Buy a cheap case, they break.
Buy a cheap case, they break.
The key thing that she did that's really critical is, school boards, as you point out, are cautious groups. And so they try to restrict the things the kids can do with the tablet. If a kid feels the tablet is only about homework or classroom work, and it's not about things they want to do, their respect and reverence for it will change. So one of the things you got to find is the right mix of functionality. You can't let them do everything with a tablet because that could wander into some places you don't want them to wander into.
Right.
But if the kid has value to that tablet, she will protect it in a way that she protects no textbook.
How far are you letting people? This is a very important point because also everyone's going to go home and convince their districts to go do this. And letting them take them home, and what else do you let the kids put on their devices? So
you think about, so two things. One is, yes, restrict access to places that are where students should not be. This is very, very simple. This is not a large policy discussion. You don't want kids in places where there are predatory issues, and you don't want kids on content that is grossly inappropriate. We can solve that problem. So should kids be able to put music on there? Why not? I mean, why are we restricting that? They're putting it on everything else. They're listening to the music during your orientation around this issue. So the notion is, if it is mine and I can customize this, and you realize we're going to wipe it clean when we take it from you anyways, while you have it there, make it as personalized as possible. Your photos, your music, your apps, that students are creating apps, that makes sense.
Do they keep it over the summer?
And so the notion is, we're in the debate of, should they go home? The power and transformation in homes who have never had technology before, of course it should go home. It is going to become a center of community and family learning that we'll never do in parent university as we try to do parent education. The opportunity for communities who have never had voice to have voice before is transformational in large communities of poverty.
So a couple of points. One, when you say voice, one of the big opportunities is for more parent engagement. Can you measure additional parent engagement and parents being able to give voice to the school as well?
Yeah, actually very, very easily. You can do that directly through survey. You can do that directly through the parent portal, which we create. I mean,
I'm saying, how are you seeing that now that they have tablets and they take it home?
We're
what are the numbers?
Much higher engagement.
With parents?
With parents and guardians. We're also watching something else, which is, now remember, let's be balanced here. A lot of criticism. I mean, I live in a world of constant criticism and critique.
Yeah, but this is the de-risk panel.
Okay, right.
This is not the scale. This is easy. We should all be doing it. It's going to be hard, but this is more on the de-risk part.
Very interesting little piece.
Minutes.
You know, we have a local newspaper, newspaper of record, writes a lot about this issue. And I remember one day I was watching a story, and there was 78 comments, and they were just some of them were really pretty horrific, nasty comments. And I said to myself, I could be angry, I could be upset. I was actually fascinated by the fact when 900,000 students, every one of those comments was written on a tablet to the LA Times. When 900,000 students have voice they didn't have before, you transform a city. Okay? The silence of youth who live in a circumstance of poverty, those days are coming to an end really, really quick, and I think that's very healthy.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's see, helping people withstand the heat. Joel, you want to give us a minute about your advice on helping people withstand heat when you want to change something big?
Look, my advice is we need leadership. People like John Dacey, who takes enormous heat every day, not just about what he's doing here. In the meantime, the LA School District is so much better than it was because of the things he's been doing. And if you want to be popular and be a hero, then don't go into transformative things like education, because by necessity, you're going to disrupt the status quo that has vast numbers of defenders. And if you like to be liked, there are a lot of other things you can do in life, but going in and telling people we have new and different ways, we're holding you accountable to standards you've never been held accountable for, we're actually going to prioritize the needs of our children over the needs of the adults in the system. Those kind of things are not messages that are warm and cuddly. As somebody said, a lot of school reform is sort of the message is eat your broccoli. And most people don't like that message. But if we don't get around to actually doing the tough, transformative, risk-taking work that people like John and Kevin Huffman and others are doing throughout the country, then we're not going to get the changes. And this is, to me, the fundamental question for our country is whether we have at every level the leadership we need commensurate with the challenges the country faces. We know the solutions, but the question is whether those who own the status quo will enable us to find the leadership that will disrupt the status quo on a vast range of issues that we need to face as a country. And I just think it's appropriate for this panel to recognize how valuable people like John Dacey are to our country and to the future of this country.
I agree.
And I obviously deeply appreciate that. In some ways, Rafi, this is very elegantly simple. We're not confused about our mission. We lift youth out of poverty so that this workforce can be viable and strong. I mean, and so if you're focused on that as the reason we open the doors, it's the reason we open access, then it becomes a little bit easier to kind of withstand the unhealthy, but also the healthy good critique. I think where we're in need of stronger work is on supporting the same kind of stuff around policy leaders who are doing this. Governmental policy leaders, school policy leaders, that's a place where that kind of strength also needs to be recognized.
And hopefully the people in this room all know a policy leader or two.
I wanted to, just emphasize something here that I think is so important, and that is these devices and this software is going to empower a whole different way of doing things and change the way a lot of kids. Just for a second, put up slide 14. And I really want to emphasize this. Because of political correctness, we've had slow be equated to stupid. We're not allowed to say stupid, but we can say slow. Turns out there's a lot of really, really smart kids who just take a little bit longer. And if we give them that extra time, they're actually super performers. And so I think that we can, in the next few years, we can take kids who have grown up thinking that they're dumb as a post and all of a sudden mainstream them in a way that they haven't thought was possible, let alone their teachers. So I just wanted to really, yell this one out.
You're
Right.
absolutely right.
Bravo.
There's thousands of examples like that. We have kids, you know, teachers who say to us, this kid, I thought he was totally lost, had no clue what was going on in the classroom. Now that we're teaching stuff on the tablet, he's the most active participant in the class. He would have never raised his hand, but now, and a kid will come to me, and I'll meet with these kids, and I'll say to him, why are you doing? He said, this is the way I'm comfortable expressing myself. This is the way I express myself out of school. And so now I am so much more engaged. And it's all this notion that these kids are all very different. The question you asked me before, how many different learning styles are there in a class of 25 kids? 25. Yeah. And what we can now do is customize. One small example, we have an e-reader. I'm a big believer, don't take kids off the page. If you take them off the page to a dictionary, you may never get them back to the page. So I keep them on the page, I give them a one word. Our e-reader pops up, gives them a one word. But now I know that this kid doesn't know diligent or doesn't know necessary. And so all of a sudden I've got a private vocabulary of words that this kid's struggling with. And I drive him 4 to 6 lessons on that, videos, YouTube things, exercises, and all the research says if he gets about 6 of these, he'll master the word. And we then incentivize it. You get rewards on our system if you use the word in the e-writer. And so as a result of that, no teacher could do this, to customize a vocabulary list for every single kid, some of whom know necessary and don't know diligent, some of whom know diligent and don't know necessary. And you thought to think of the power of that kind of customization across the whole spectrum of learning. You begin to see a future that's so different from the one we have now, and that's so much more customized to the individual student, and your example of the slow kid who's actually much more engaged ultimately, but who's afraid that if he doesn't move at the pace of the class, he'll get lost and therefore drops out. And I had kids like that in New York all the time.
We've got a wrap. Thank you, Joel. Joel, Roger, John, Jim, Nolan. Thank you, guys. I think it's extraordinary what everybody's doing here. I think particularly in that whether or not we all like to be liked, we all seem to have chosen a bunch of work in education and to focus enormous personal efforts in to make change, which has extraordinary outcomes, kid by kid, city by city, state by state, country by country. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you to our audience.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.